Hello everyone and welcome to yet another video from Remember the Regulars. I'm your host Chris and I'll be giving you a very kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the key characters of the Home Forces during the Second World War. So in my previous video I introduced you to the Regular and Territorial Army and the other forces, the professional armies that were deployed in the UK to defend the country against invasion, in particular in 1940, 1941 and 1942. And I outlined that the defence of the UK was by no means the sole responsibility of the Home Guard, and in the vast majority of cases it wasn't until much later in the war that the Home Guard became the primary defenders of the country. And up until that point they were second line troops. They were by no means autonomous or solely responsible for defending the country. The defence of the country fell on the shoulders of professional soldiers, as you would kind of expect. But today, thanks to Dad's Army, that is largely overlooked, unfortunately. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the Commanders-in-Chief of Home Forces. As always, these videos are completely unscripted. I aim for them to be very brief, but sometimes I might go off on a tangent because I'm not working with scripts. If I use notes, it's obvious that I'm bloody reading things and it just doesn't come across as natural. So I always prefer to rely on my own knowledge and my own experience to tell the story rather than reading a script. You know, it doesn't work for me. So let's have a look at the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. So first things first, what was the role of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces? Well, I can't remember if I mentioned it in the previous video, but the Home Forces was the military organisation responsible for multiple things in terms of defending the UK. And at the top of this organisation was the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. So this was the commander of the Home Forces, to put it simply. And their role within the Home Forces was obviously to command the Home Forces, as suggested by their job title. But this role involved several different tasks. So as I'm sure many of you have kind of worked out now, one of those roles was setting up the defence of the country in the event of invasion threats, for example. But they also had some other quite key roles to this job. First of these were coordinating troops of the armed forces, in particular the infantry or the army, let's say, because the infantry are just one aspect of the army. But it was their role to coordinate and move and see the deployment of troops within the UK, for example. So any body of troops deployed in the UK would have been under the direct command, to a certain extent, of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, and they would be told where to go and where to be deployed through the chain of command associated with the Home Forces. The second role as well, and this is one of the key things as well that comes into play later on, is that the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces was also responsible for the efforts to support, equip, and train the Home Forces as well. So the units within the Home Forces. So it wasn't just a role in terms of active defence. They had an almost logistical role in supporting troops deployed in the UK as well. So ensuring that they had the relevant equipment, ensuring that they were trained properly to undertake their role within the Home Forces, which was a key thing in terms of allowing these troops to be deployed later on. So when they were deployed in the UK, they didn't just sit around defending the country. They were also undertaking a lot of training. So things like undergoing exercises, drill, going out on the ranges to fire the weapons and get used to firing and build up those skills and things like that. So the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces had three key roles. The final of these was coordinating the defence of the UK at various points during the Second World War. And this is one of the reasons why we see multiple defence strategies deployed during the Second World War. So there wasn't just one defensive strategy deployed in the Second World War. There were multiple defence strategies deployed to defend the UK from the various threats of invasion. And these are tied inextricably, tied massively. I can't think of the word now. The word's gone. But these are intrinsically tied to the person who was undertaking the role of Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, and this is kind of like a key aspect of understanding this period is. Sorry, I'm just going to take this plaster off. I cut my hand earlier, and I've got a plaster, and now I've just given myself a bit of a waxing on the hand there and taken some of the hair off. Anyway, I'm getting distracted now. It was the various personalities that took on the role of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces and different ways in which they saw fit to defend the country. And this is why we see a vast amount of change over the course of the Second World War. Today, some of these roles and some of these defensive strategies are more well known than others, as we'll come to see. So let's have a look at the first character in terms of the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces. So just a brief mention of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. The Home Forces were initially established during the First World War, and we see a lot of this military organisation from the First World War reintroduced in the Second World War in terms of home defence. So at the outbreak of the Second World War, General Walter Kirk was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. So everyone knows about the invasion threat in 1940 and 41 following the fall of France. As I mentioned in the previous video, the threat of invasion reared its head pretty much instantly as soon as war was declared. So Walter Kirk was the first Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces during the Second World War, and as I've already mentioned, he was given this role of coordinating the defence of the country, training or coordinating training, defence and equipment of soldiers, and also deploying the units deployed in the UK or stationed in the UK at the time. So, in October 1939, it was Walter Kirk that came up with the first plan of defence of the UK, and this was termed the Julius Caesar plan. I can't quite remember how this works, but Julius and Caesar were two code words. So when Julius was announced to the Home Forces, they would, I think, stand to or have to be at something like 6 hours readiness to counter an invasion. And this was an invasion that was imminent, essentially. And then when the code word Caesar was issued, this means that enemy troops had landed on the coast. I think it was something like that, but don't quote me on that. I'll come back to that at a different point in the future. But yeah, so the Julius Caesar plan was the first scheme of active defence, which was drawn up less than a month after the war was declared in 1939. Under this plan, various divisions and bodies of troops were deployed primarily to the East Coast. So you see East Anglia, several divisions deployed there, various places along the East Coast. And the idea behind this was that there was this perceived imminent threat of invasion from ports in northern Germany. Today, you know, these threats are constant. You mention these threats and everyone goes, oh, it never happened. That's not the point. The point is that the Commander-in-Chiefs of Home Forces were reacting to perceived threats and potential threats. It doesn't matter if these threats today in hindsight might not have taken place or would never have happened. They were reacting to the potential for threats. And this is a key thing to remember later and a key point that I'll keep on making and banging on about. So, Walter Kirk, his Julius Caesar plan focused around denying the enemy key ports on the East Coast, so ports like Great Yarmouth, King's Lynn, the Humber ports, so Hull, and the most major port in the country today after Dover that I can't remember the name of, Immingham, and ports further north. So a lot of the defences were focused around stretches of beach where enemy troops could be landed and these major ports, because one of the key objectives for an invading force would be to capture a port. And the key fear at this time was that the Germans would land, capture a port immediately and use that to supply the invading force. That's something for another story. We'll go into that in more detail later when we'll look at these various plans. Anyway, coming into 1940, we see Kirk develop the Julius Caesar plan further in May 1940 as a reaction to the invasion of Denmark and Norway. So the fall of Denmark and Norway is one of the key points where the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces and the military went, crap, we're in a bit of a dire situation here. Now Germany has invaded Denmark and Norway. The East Coast, pretty much the entirety of the East Coast, is vulnerable to an invasion threat and potential for invasion. You also have as well the fortification of the Shetland Isles as well. So the Shetland Isles sits something like only 300 miles away from occupied Norway at the time. And there's this key fear that, you know, you can sail an invading force within the space of something like 12 hours overnight, or something like that, 9 to 12 hours overnight, hit the Shetland Isles, capture those, push down through Orkney, capture Scapa Flow, and then potentially northern Scotland. This is the key fear at the time, following the fall of France and Denmark. And it was Kirk, again, who had this opportunity, or was given the task as Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces to develop the Julius Caesar plan later to counter this new threat. Coming on to further in May 1940, it was Kirk that was responsible for forming the local defence volunteers that later became the Home Guard. Today, this is often attributed to Winston Churchill for some reason. In some cases, you see Anthony Eden credited with forming the Home Guard. It wasn't them. Anthony Eden made the announcement that the Home Guard was to be formed, and Churchill later, in July or something like that, suggested the Home Guard's the LDV's name should be changed to the Home Guard. But neither of those people were responsible for putting together the local defence volunteers. It was General Kirk, and he gets overlooked in this. So the idea behind the local defence volunteers, as it was envisioned by Kirk, was to create a body of voluntary troops who and civilian troops who had prior military experience, so such as First World War veterans who at this point would have been in their mid to late 40s, which is constantly overlooked. It's thanks to Dad's Army, the defence, the LDV and the Home Guard is often seen as primarily the reserve of doddery old fools in their 60s and 70s, and the reality is that the age was much lower than many people realise. And the aim of these was to free up the regular and territorial army troops by defending lesser vulnerable points of lesser importance, let's say. So factories, telephone exchanges, and things like that. So places that didn't require a professional body of soldiers, let's say, to defend them. And this in turn would help to free up the regular and territorial army to be deployed to more important defensive positions, such as defending the coast, defending major communications hubs inland, such as major towns and cities, for example. So that clears that up. A key point as well with Walter Kirk is that in his role as the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, as I've already mentioned, they had an almost logistical role in terms of gathering resources. So Kirk is often credited, he was credited by a chap we'll see in a bit, as doing the much needed thing of gathering the resources needed for home defence. And he is often credited with being vital to setting the foundation, let's say, of the later defensive schemes. So Kirk set the foundation, and then the other Commander-in-Chiefs of Home Forces built upon that. So yeah, key point was that Kirk was instrumental in holding back various forces and various resources in the UK to undertake this role of home defence. So although Kirk was in place from the outbreak of war, soon as things started to turn sour in 1940, he was retired relatively quickly. So towards the end, I think it was the 25th of May 1940, Kirk is retired. And we see this kind of process of Commander-in-Chiefs of Home Forces being retired relatively quickly in 1940. So that's Walter Kirk. He needs a lot more attention than he gets today. He is completely overlooked and gets literally no credit today for what he did during the Second World War. So remember his name is worth looking at in more detail. Coming on to Ironside, General Edmund Tiny Ironside. He had the nickname Tiny because he was something like 6'5". He was built like a brick outhouse. Ironside is relatively well known today, but his role is and his experiences during the Second World War in terms of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, he gets a lot of stick, and unfairly so. Not just in my opinion, from looking at what he achieved. So he was appointed on the 27th of May 1940. He superseded General Kirk, and at this time it's worth mentioning that 27th of May almost pretty much coincides with the evacuation that was undertaken from Dunkirk, so today popularly known as the Dunkirk evacuation, officially known as Operation Dynamo. Key point here to mention is one of the myths surrounding Dunkirk today is this impression that Dunkirk marked the end of fighting in France. It didn't. Fighting in France continued for almost another month after troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. Dunkirk as well in Operation Dynamo was one of only 3 operations to remove troops from France. So you also have Operation Cycle and Operation Ariel, which are 2 additional events which took place to evacuate troops from northern and western ports in France, but you never hear about those. And in some cases, troops were even redeployed to France through those operations to continue the fighting. Story for another time, but please remember that Dynamo and the little ships in Dunkirk was not the end of fighting. It did not mark the end of fighting in France. And also, I believe well, I've read that the German forces received most of their casualties post Dunkirk as well. So again, you rarely hear about that. Anyway, Ironside was kind of dropped in it, given this unenviable task of kind of reorganising a battered army that was lacking equipment, most of which had been lost during the fighting in France and abandoned. So he had this unenviable task of reorganising the units deployed within the home forces, deploying them across the UK. So when they were pulled out of France, they didn't just sit around and mope and be depressed and go and take a bit of a time for rest and recuperation. The troops that were pulled out of France were deployed across the UK pretty much immediately. So they were under strength. They had very little in the way of resources, but they still had this key role in defending the UK. They didn't just sit back and let the Home Guard mess around on the coast. That did not happen. It was still the role of the regular and territorial armies to defend the country, and it didn't matter what state they were in, they still had to undertake that task. So, also in line with this, Ironside had the further unenviable task of coordinating the defence of the UK as well, and he was left with a depleted force to work with, and he was given very little options in terms of how he could defend the country. So he focused on establishing linear stop lines, a defence in depth strategy focused around linear stop lines, which get all the focus today. Stop lines are seen as the only defensive strategy. The reality is they weren't. Defensive stop lines were only in use for a 2-month period officially, although construction of them continued in some cases into early 1941, January, February time. The stop line strategy was only official strategy for a 2-month period. They were superseded relatively quickly. In between these linear stop lines devised by Ironside, you also have nodal points. So these became prominent later on, as we'll see in a bit. But again, today nodal points get completely overlooked in favour of this linear stop line strategy. Nodal points were defended towns and villages, places where the road and rail network converged, so major crossroads, places where the road and rail network cross rivers. So the key thing here is that although the road network gets a lot of the attention, the rail network was key to defence as well, because you can move vehicles across, such as tanks, across the rail network just as quickly as you can, or almost as quickly as you can on road. So key to denying the enemy this thrust inland was denying them the road and the rail network. And so you get linear stop lines creating this defence in depth, and then between that you have every single town and village essentially denied to the enemy. Ironside's role in setting up the nodal points gets completely overlooked, and everyone looks at the stop lines and goes, oh, they were rubbish, they were linear, they were First World War. If you break through them, you can just push through and overwhelm the defenders. When you ignore the nodal points, the defensive strategy kind of falls apart. But today very few people look at the wider defensive strategy. You also don't hear about the General Headquarters Reserve set up by Ironside either. So there needs to be a greater reassessment of Ironside's role in defending the country, and it's long overdue. His role often gets completely crapped on, unfortunately. And again, like I've already said, he started the reorganisation of the army as well. So he set he started building the initial parts of the building, let's say, on which Kirk had set the foundation. So Kirk set the foundation, Ironside started building the building, and he set the way for General Alan Brooke. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was a relatively quick turnover of Commander-in-Chiefs of Home Forces in 1940. Ironside's strategy fell out of favour in terms of the War Department and the powers that be, and he was quickly replaced by General Alan Brooke on the 19th of July 1940. So this is one of the reasons why the stop line strategy was very short-lived. It took some time for Alan Brooke to reassess and reorganise the defensive strategy, and as a result, I think it was construction of stop lines was halted immediately, officially, on the appointment of General Alan Brooke, but construction in most cases continued into August 1940, and in some cases later into early 1941. So I've already mentioned about the nodal point strategy. So this was developed by Ironside. This set the foundation for Alan Brooke's defensive strategy, which focused around what I call nodal points, and they were called nodal points at the time. But you get nodal points, anti-tank islands, defended localities, and all this, a whole range. But I just bung that all together with nodal points because it saves me having to reel off all the different types of defences. So stop lines are out, nodal points are in. We see the defences that were constructed or had been constructed as part of the stop lines, where possible, incorporated into these nodal points. And the idea behind the nodal point system is that you completely deny the road network and the rail network to the enemy. Essentially, every place that the invading force would have to take is heavily defended. It leaves the enemy two options: either to fight these nodal points head on, which would be extremely costly in terms of numbers of troops and resources, or it forces them to go around, at which point these anti-tank islands, for example, would hold out in the rear and continue to be a nuisance behind the enemy, further slowing down other troops and being costly in resources. But again, this is something I will cover in the future in more detail exclusively. It's worth pointing out that by the time Alan Brooke was given the role of Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, he had access to better resources, including small arms, vehicles, tanks and artillery. So mainly the resources that have been lost in France have started to be replaced effectively within this 2-month period, although we do see lack of equipment continue to hinder the defence of the country well into 1941. Alan Brooke was in a much better position in terms of available troops and equipment in 1940 when he was appointed. So, again, just to reiterate, he completely got rid of the stop line strategy. Stop lines weren't being used for a very long period at all, despite getting all the attention today. And Alan Brooke started to modernise the defence of the UK, and he had a lot better resources to play with. He also retained the General Headquarters Reserve, which was this mobile body of troops inland as well. So what are we on? Coming up to 20 minutes. I'm going to start to wrap this up as quickly as possible because I don't like these videos to be any longer than 20 minutes or so. Right. Alan Brooke was quite lucky. He wasn't retired. He wasn't given an early retirement. He was bumped up the chain of command and he became the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. So that was quite a prestigious role. He was bumped up the chain of command in December 1941. So he had a relatively good innings as Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. He was replaced by General Sir Bernard Paget. So Paget doesn't really get much attention either. He was appointed, as I say, in December 1941 and later became the Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command in January 1944. So he remained in place for a good time. From what I've seen, I need to do more research into Paget because I haven't looked into him very much because, well, I've got other things to do. As far as I'm aware, he retained Brooke's defensive strategy of nodal points. Key thing coming into 1942 is that he oversaw the release of regular troops from active service elsewhere. So it's at this point that we start to see the Home Guard start to be trained up to become an almost primary fighting force in 1942, late 42, 43, let's say. This allowed the release of regular and territorial army troops to be deployed elsewhere across the world to continue fighting the war, but also to train for the reinvasion of France, D-Day, Operation Overlord later. And it was Paget that was ultimately responsible for the decision to draw down the anti-invasion defences. So the anti-invasion defences themselves started to be drawn down in 1943. In some places this was much earlier, as early as 1941 in parts of Scotland, for example. So the anti-invasion defence shelf life was relatively short. It was deemed by December 1942 that the threat of immediate invasion had disappeared. It was gone. Germans were busy fighting in Africa and on the Eastern Front, and as a result there was very little chance that they would be able to undertake an invasion of the UK. But there was the possibility that the situation might change. So troops, the threat of invasion might become imminent in the future, and as a result this plan was drawn up in late 1942, 1943 that the regular army would be trained to go off elsewhere, but if needs be they could be brought back to the UK, or the Home Forces and the troops deployed already in the UK could quickly be redeployed to take up a more active role of defence as they had done from 1939 to 1941 into 1942. So by the time the Home Guard become the primary force of defence, the threat of invasion is over, officially over, or deemed to be over, and if the situation did change, then the regulars and TAs would be brought back in to take on the primary role of defence. You also see as well with the Home Guard that their coastal defence, for example, was relatively limited. They were limited to occupying or garrisoning coastal artillery batteries, for example. They wouldn't have been spread across the coast, occupying pillboxes and all this. They would have been solely responsible for operating coastal artillery batteries, for example. The extent of the defences by 1942-43 is nowhere near as extensive as it was in 1940-41. So yeah, Paget did quite well as well. He got bumped up and took on a new role in January 1944, and he was replaced by oh sorry, I've lost my. Here we go. He was replaced by General Harold Franklin. So Franklin, I know literally nothing about, unfortunately. He had a key role in within the Home Forces at various points. I think he was Commander-in-Chief of what was it? The Ireland Irish Island Command, Northern Ireland Command, and he'd had various roles within divisions within the Home Force in the UK. But by the time he replaced General Paget in January 1944, the invasion threat was over. So he had very little role, as far as I'm aware, in terms of organising the defence of the UK. And like I say, I need to do more research into him, but I'm fairly certain his role was relatively minor. Anyway, hopefully that covers the key characters in terms of the Commander-in-Chief of Home Force. I hope that's been useful and gives you some idea of as to who was responsible for defending the UK and planning the defence of the UK and when they were responsible for doing that. I quite like this picture here because this was taken in Northern Command. You've got what's his name? Alan Brooke there in the centre, and he's surrounded by the Commander-in-Chief of Northern Command and the One Corps and all this stuff. Anyway, hopefully that's been useful. This is Remember the Regulars. I'll catch you in the future with a new video. So see you later. Thank you for watching and goodbye.